welcome to another edition of the Sports Pro podcast. I am your host, Tom Bassam, and this week we are going to be talking all about athletics. Now, we're not just doing that because the Olympics is on. That is a good reason, but we're also doing it because we've got a very high-profile guest. When I say high-profile, I mean at one point this guy was the fastest person on the planet. His name is Michael Johnson. You may well know him now as a BBC commentator on the athletics, but he is a four-time Olympic gold medalist. And recently, he announced the launch of a new series in that world of athletics called Grand Slam Track. Earlier on this week, my colleague Sam Carp was lucky enough to get some time with Michael Johnson to talk about Grand Slam Track, what's going on in the world of track and field right now, how Michael sees the current state of play and what needs to change. As I said, recorded earlier in the week before the track and field got underway with my colleague Sam Carp. I'll hand over to Sam now.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to ask, what have been your impressions, I guess, of Paris so far?
I thought when I arrived here, it was pretty smooth. Everything was pretty well organized. When you get to our games, you expect chaos. So it's pretty good. Unfortunately, rain's been an issue for the opening ceremonies. They made an ambitious plan to move outside of the traditional stadium. And I think for it to work really well as they wanted it to, and they had planned for it to, you needed to have perfect conditions. And obviously it was far from perfect conditions, which was out of their control with the rain. So I'm not quite sure it sort of kicked off the way they would have expected or hoped. But sunny day today, it's day two. Yesterday was rain as well, almost all day. So sunny day today, day two. So hopefully from here on out, it gets going in the way that they intended.
Yeah, I hope so as well. I arrive tomorrow, so fingers crossed it's stage dry for that. You had one of the drier seats in the house, I guess, in the BBC studio, right? Would you have kind of enjoyed it, do you think, being paraded down a river like that back when you were competing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the one area, though, I think where it may have worked a little bit better for the athletes, despite the rain. I mean, putting that aside for a minute, I think, typically for an opening ceremony, you're kind of just standing and waiting for a very long time, and then waiting for, your country to march into the stadium. You do that. That's probably a good, for the U.S. team, because it's such a big team. It's always 30 minutes or so just marching into the stadium. But then once you're there, then you're just standing for a long time again, waiting for all of the rest of the ceremony. And for those athletes who are early, waiting on all of the other countries, I mean, they're waiting for hours. And most of the athletes are just sitting there waiting for hours, standing in the middle of the infield waiting for the cauldron to be lit and all of that stuff. So I think that this may have been a bit of a better experience, for the athletes to be able to, be on the boats going down the Seine River, waving at fans and being a little bit more interactive. Looked like they were having a good time anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And you get to kind of, I guess, see one of the most iconic cities in the world in the process, right? So it must have been pretty cool from that perspective.
Yeah.
I guess let's part of the Olympics just for a second, and we'll come on to Grand Slam Track. Obviously, you'd been teasing the idea of a new competition for quite some time, and then sort of earlier this year formally announced the identity, the structure, the format, until you announced some sort of executive hires recently as well. Just kind of wanted to ask, first and foremost, I suppose, why does track and field need a competition like this? What was the thinking behind launching it?
It's a good question, but I think, the answer is so very evident, because for the last 20 years, I continue to get asked the same question by almost all of the media about track and field. Like, what's going to happen? What needs to happen? What needs to change? Is track and field dying? I've been asked that question for the last 20 years, the same question over and over and over again. So it's evident that something needs to happen. And I was tired of having to answer the question. And the opportunity came along to do something about it. So the simple answer beyond that is fans obviously haven't been happy. Athletes haven't been happy for a very long time. And those are the two most critical stakeholders in the sport. So Grand Slam Track is a solution for both of them. The fans want to see the best of the best athletes compete together and against one another much more frequently than they have seen them. Athletes want to be recognized for their great performances. They want to compete against one another as well, but rightfully so. They want to be compensated for that. They look at their cohorts in other sports and see how they're recognized and how they're compensated, how they're treated as true professionals. And they want that for themselves as well. So Grand Slam Track sort of sits in the middle of fans and athletes, and, fans need athletes. Athletes need fans. in order to accomplish what they want. And so our job sitting in the middle of both of those is to deliver much better competition, head-to-head competition, the storytelling, so fans get to know who these athletes are and the high stakes that athletes appreciate and that draw out great performances.
Had you kind of always envisioned that you might be the person launching something like this? Had you always envisioned perhaps going into, I guess, running a professional sports league, I suppose? Had you kind of hoped that it would come from within the sport itself and that someone would kind of figure it out beforehand? Did you feel like, you had to be the one to kind of take this step and make that change because you didn't kind of see it forthcoming otherwise?
I think it's probably, if you look at most other thriving sports, when you say come from within the sport, I think we're so used to the federations running the sport at the professional level. That's probably what you mean when you say from within the sport. But if you really think about it, most of the sports don't operate that way, where the federation, which is typically responsible for rules and governance, and which they're very good at, they're typically not as involved in the actual professional commercialization marketing of the sport. You take something like Formula One, the FIA does not run Formula One. It's Liberty Media that's doing that, and they're a for-profit private organization that is doing that. And so you think about the NFL or the English Premier League, it's not, the Football Federation that's doing that. It's not the English FA that's running the Premier League, so the same situation was always going to be needed for track and field, is to have, a commercially minded marketing expertise type of organization that could actually come in, take this sport and commercialize it in the way that it needs. That is somewhat the situation already, but I think, with the Diamond League, because Diamond League is not owned by World Athletics, but I think in this sport, for some reason, and primarily because it's such a prominent Olympic sport, and for Olympic sports, we typically look for the federations to do everything, and I think that it's time for us to look elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess is that kind of the approach then? I guess the mentality going into it is that operating as more of a traditional professional sports league, I suppose. Also, I suppose your job title within the organisation speaks to that as well a little bit, right? Commissioner. I'm not sure we've had a commissioner in athletics before, but I think that kind of speaks to, right, the kind of the approach and the strategy behind it.
Yeah, I mean, we've built Grand Slam track from the playbooks of other professional sports. That's how we've looked at this from the very beginning. How do they structure themselves? What's their approach? What's the business model for those sports? And we've taken those playbooks to build Grand Slam track, as opposed to starting from track itself and building from where we are now as a sport, because I think that would severely limit us. Now, having said that, the one thing that, I've been very, very adamant about with our team is, we won't change the basic structure of track and field, because it's a great sport. We don't really need gimmicks in order to make this sport, and we don't need to change it dramatically in order to make it compelling. We just need to deliver more of it with the high stakes and great athletes and storytelling that you get here, like in Paris at the Olympic Games once every 4 years. We need to deliver that more often to the fans.
Yeah, definitely. Winners Alliance, the commercial arm of the PTPA, they've come on board as your lead partner, I guess your lead investor. What was that process like, I suppose? Was there quite a lot of interest in what you were trying to launch? And I guess how did you then go about narrowing down, I guess, the people that you wanted to be involved in this venture with you?
It was very validating for me once I went out and started to talk with potential investors. There was so much interest. I didn't do a roadshow, didn't do the traditional. I've raised funds for startups before, and I didn't do the traditional sort of roadshow and speak to a lot of different potential investors. I went to 2 strategic type of investors that I knew would be potentially interested in this, and both were very interested. And with their sort of interest in athlete rights and athlete collectives and the commercialization of athlete collectives, was a natural fit for what I'm trying to do here, because that is a very important part of Grand Slam track is, providing more value for the athletes in this sport. And they certainly get that and have extensive experience in that area. So they made a great capital partner for us from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously Winners kind of, as you said, the PTPA commercial arm of that sort of launched within tennis, and obviously Grand Slam track is kind of borrowing some terminology from tennis in the Grand Slam sense, and those are obviously the pinnacle in tennis. We're talking during the Olympics, but is that kind of what you want Grand Slam track to become? Do you want it to become the pinnacle? Do you see it kind of going up against the Olympics at all, or is the Olympics still going to be that kind of, that pinnacle moment in the sport? Or do you kind of want Grand Slam track to be alongside that? Do you want it to sit alongside what athletes are striving for every 4 years?
Yeah, I think, it's one of the advantages we have with Grand Slam track is it is already the premier Olympic sport. Track and field is the premier Olympic sport, and we don't want to change that. I think that's fantastic. I think it's one of the advantages we have is that every 4 years when, the Olympics comes around, track and field is front and center and at the top of the list of sports that people want to see. It's the top of the list of the sports that people think about, when they think of the Olympics. So we think that that's an advantage for us. The track has a very long and storied history. Some of our greatest moments, and myself included as an athlete, my greatest moments were at the Olympic Games. We want to add to that. We think that, what fans have experienced prior to now and prior to Grand Slam track during the Olympics is fantastic. But they have indicated that they want more of it. The casual fan as well that watches and tunes in during the Olympics wants more of it. And that's what Grand Slam track is here for.
For sure. And you've spoken quite a bit about, I guess, the fan experience, the athlete experience, potentially maybe the broadcast experience further down the line will be slightly different as well. You've mentioned the word gimmick a couple of times. How do you do that without being gimmicky? A lot of new leagues that launch kind of promise that, right? They promise innovation in certain areas, and then once they are launched, it's sometimes challenging to see that. How are you sort of thinking about how you can make that evolution and provide an experience that is unique for all those stakeholders that are involved?
Again, one of the advantages we have as compared to those other sort of new leagues that you mentioned is a lot of those are new sports that have never really even existed before. Or they've existed only in the recreational space, but not as a professional sport. Let's say, for example, the advantage we have is that this sport has been around forever. It is the oldest sport, literally the oldest sport. And so it has existed forever. It is compelling, as I said before, every 4 years during the Olympic Games. People watch it, they love it. So we don't need to recreate the sport. We don't need gimmicks. What we do need to do, and one of the issues with the sport, is that the production and presentation of the sport hasn't been updated in decades. The same type of presentation of the sport has remained for a very long time, although people's viewing habits have changed dramatically over the last several decades. The way people consume sport has changed dramatically. The way sports are produced and presented has changed dramatically, but we haven't done that in track. So what we need to do is, it's not easy, but simply put, we need to update the presentation. We need to rethink the way that we present the sport, how we produce the sport, with the viewer in mind. I've spent a lot of time going to track meets and presenting track meets myself as a broadcaster for BBC for the last 22 years. And this is what you get a lot of times with a federation being involved. The sport is for the athletes. And so when I'm sitting there as a fan, I feel like it's not for me. It's for the athletes, and I'm just invited to come and watch. But it isn't produced for me. And professional sports, by their very nature, are entertainment for the fans and built for the fans. That's where the value comes in for the athletes. When you're providing entertainment for fans with great athletes, the great athletes are rewarded for that. Typically what has happened in our sport is we have one major competition every year, and all of the other competitions outside of that are for the athletes to prepare for that one competition at the end of the year. But they're not built for fans. They're built for the athletes and giving them an opportunity to prepare. So it ends up then not being great entertainment. So what we need to do is, again, taking the playbooks from traditional sports, professional sports that are thriving, and apply that to track, where we're now delivering that entertainment for fans.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess give them a reason to care, I suppose, with with events that matter. I wanted to ask about that because you mentioned there's typically one event every year that the calendar builds up to, and lots of meets outside of that. There are a lot of meets at the moment, right? And then we're going to have these Grand Slams thrown into the mix as well. Do you think something in the calendar is going to have to give at some point, or is that something you've maybe spoken about with other stakeholders within the sport in terms of, how you will kind of coexist together as well and make sure that the load that athletes are being given isn't too much and they are able to kind of allocate their time appropriately across those various events that they are able to compete in.
Yeah. So as I just mentioned, the structure of the sport right now isn't like other sports where you have a minimum requirement number of meets that you need to compete in, and then Grand Slam track is coming in and adding 4 more. That's not the case. There is no minimum number that the athletes have to compete in. That's another one of the issues for fans. Fans don't know when the athletes are going to compete. They don't know where they're going to compete. The athletes have the ability to enter into a meet a week before that competition is to start, or pull out of that meet if they previously announced that they were intending to compete, because again, the entire structure is primarily set up for the athletes and for their convenience, for whatever they need to do to be ready for that competition at the end of the season. So Grand Slam track won't replace anything else. They can all coexist because the athletes have the option to compete wherever they want. The athletes currently don't compete very much in comparison to other sports. Track and field athletes, by and large, spend more time training than competing, which is another reason why they are not able to realize very much value. And the athletes have indicated they want to compete more, but they do believe, and I agree with them, that they should be compensated properly if they're going to go out there and compete against their best competition. We have talked to the stakeholders in the sport, other competitions, World Athletics as well, to make sure that we are fitting in the best way that we can into the current existing structure of the sport. But you have to remember as well that, let's say, for example, last year's World Championships, there were over 2,500 athletes who competed in the World Championships last year. Over 10,000 athletes around the world competed in the Continental Tour, which is put on by World Athletics last year. That's a lot of athletes. They need places to compete. So you need a lot of competitions in this sport because there are so many athletes scattered around the world competing in the sport.
Sorry to interrupt your podcast. This is just a quick reminder that as a listener to the podcast, you can get a exclusive 10% discount on an annual Sports Pro Plus membership. If you're not yet a Sports Pro Plus member, I implore you to go and sign up. It's our subscription product. It's packed full of extremely important and very useful features, inclusive but not limited to our media hub, which features things like market spotlights, media rights trackers, quarterly deal analysis, all of our extensively researched and wonderfully produced commercial guides. Sports Pro Plus readers also get access to our in-depth analysis of the biggest news in the sports industry. And as I said, Sports Pro podcast listeners can get an exclusive 10% discount now. That is if you use the code podcast10 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply, and that is for an annual subscription only. Thank you very much, and let's return to our regularly scheduled listening.
And it wasn't long after you guys announced this that we saw World Athletics obviously launch a new event, the Ultimate Championship. We've also seen them introduce prize money at the Olympics now, which we're going to see for the first time in Paris. Do you think part of that was inspired by projects like you guys launching? Do you think you've kind of been a bit of a catalyst for that in terms of the federation waking up a little bit and saying, oh, wow, we now need to sort of incentivize our athletes a little bit more to compete in our events? Do you think that's kind of an impact that you've already had?
I hope so, and I hope we have that sort of impact that's going to spread beyond just Grand Slam track, and because we want to lift the sport up as much as we can, and be cooperative where we can with World Athletics and other stakeholders in the sport, and be helpful where we can. I think it's fantastic that the Ultimate Championship will fill in what we used to call the gap year, where there wasn't a major global championship for that 1 year in the 4-year cycle. I think that'll be great, because I think the global championships where the athletes are representing their country, is important. But again, that was one of the problems as well, is that was the only way prior to Grand Slam track, the only way that athletes get a real opportunity to go out and do something significant where there are significant stakes, but they are representing their country. And for a true professional sport, the athlete will realize even more value when they can go into a major competition like we will have 4 times a year in Grand Slam track and represent their own sponsors, where now they will receive significant value back for that. It's tough for an athlete like a Sydney McLaughlin-Lebrone, who is our first ambassador, who's a New Balance athlete, but when she has her big moment here in Paris, which will be the biggest moment that she can have, or whatever that global championship every year is, the biggest branding on her is USA. and Nike, because Nike is a team sponsor. So it's very difficult then for her to realize significant value for herself when that's her big moment and she's not able to really truly represent New Balance. And it's the same for Nike athletes as well, because the Nike swoosh is very small on the uniform. It's primarily USA that they're representing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And just in terms of, I guess, commercializing Grand Slam track, then obviously you've spoken already about, how, I guess, the way fans consume sports is changing. I mean, that for what you've worked in the broadcast world for quite a long time since you finished competing on the track. I guess, where are you at in that journey in terms of discussions with broadcasters, potential sponsors as well? I guess presumably Paris is actually going to be quite a good opportunity for you to speak to some of those stakeholders, right, and try and get them on board with the idea.
Yeah, so we've been since the beginning of back in the spring talking to in discussions with all of the major broadcasters globally, with the U.S. as a priority for us, and the U.K. and Europe as well. But we are a global sport property, so we are talking to broadcasters around the globe. And those conversations continue. We're in our second round of discussions now, and then we expect that sometime in the fall that we'll be able to announce our broadcast partner. But we're very excited. Again, it's been very validating as well that all of them have, they understand the sport, they appreciate the sport, they get it. We don't have to explain to them sort of, what the sport is, why it works, why it's compelling, and all of those things. We simply have to explain, the opportunity to go out there and take the sport that everyone knows and loves, and that's extraordinarily popular once every 4 years, and deliver it 4 times every year.
What are kind of the big objectives between now and I guess the first event in 2025? I imagine obviously that broadcast deal comes into it. Also, I suppose building up that roster of athletes as well is something that's a big priority for you guys.
Yeah. So obviously, once these games are over, we'll know who the fastest are, and we'll start signing our racers for 2025 and start announcing who those racers are going to be and what that league roster is going to look like for 2025 for our inaugural year. Working with our other cities, we already announced Los Angeles as one of our slam cities. We have the other 3 already chosen. We're working with those cities and venues, but announcing those as well. Finishing up our broadcast process and getting our broadcast partners in place is a priority. We're in talks, you mentioned earlier, with sponsors as well. That's a big part of our business model. So we're in those discussions now. So getting our initial sponsors in place. Then just sort of, operationally preparing for our inaugural season. We want that experience to continue to build out that fan experience as well, which we're working on now. And also the experience for our athletes is important. So we've got a lot of work to do between now and next April, but we've got a great team on board, and everybody's very excited and head down, just sort of pushing ahead to April 2025.
Awesome. And then just that kind of, I guess, that long-term vision, then how do you, what do you want the impact of this to be? As we've mentioned already, it's already had a bit of an impact, right, in terms of inspiring a bit of change within the sport. But what's the kind of long-term objective here? How do you make this from a great idea into a sustainable project that delivers real change within track and field?
Yeah, I think it's, taking those sort of best of the best and most popular athletes in the sport, elevating them to true professional status, and that ultimately inspires the next generation of great track athletes to stay in the sport, stay with the sport, because they can see, a path forward. I think right now, you have a young 10-year-old basketball player out on the court playing, they're dreaming of being in the NBA. There's no doubt about that. That's where they know they can identify where the pinnacle of the sport is. We don't have that in our sport. And I think that, I've always been afraid that we're going to lose young athletes because they don't have that sort of, I want to be here as a track athlete. That's what I aspire to be. They don't know what that is because there isn't that sort of singular identity of an exclusive league of the best athletes that an athlete can dream to and aspire to get to. It's very fractured and very confusing in our sport. You could say, oh, I'm dreaming of, going to the Olympics. Well, that happens once every 4 years. That's not a sustainable career, to just compete every 4 years. And it's not an identifiable track league of professionals of the best. So I think that's what we can do for the sport that, really lifts it up long term.
Well, I look forward to watching it all unfold. And yeah, thanks so much.
Sure.